So, welcome. HGN Building Sense, a little bit about that. It's an initiative that started in 2020 to bring together people, information and professional expertise to help with the challenge of making homes comfortable year-round in the face of high heating bills and cutting carbon emissions. Today, we're delighted to be hosting March's Energy Agency's presentation on behalf of the Future Ready Homes programme. Future Ready Homes is running in Shropshire, Powys and Herefordshire. It's being delivered by a combination of March's Energy Agency and 7Y Energy Agency, with the support of groups such as ourselves, HGN, in Herefordshire, Lightfoot in Powys and Zero Carbon Shropshire in, of course, Shropshire. The main focus of the Future Ready Homes programme is to promote and support good practice energy retrofit across homes in the Marches area. We're doing this in a number of ways through webinar series, which is why we're here today. Green Doors, which is going to take place again this year in October, and through the provision of a number of free energy surveys and retrofit plans. The scheme is looking for a really good cross-section of building types and situations. So sadly, we're not able to offer free retrofit plans to everyone. But there are still some available and we do encourage you to apply. And finally, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers, Claire Woolley and Rob Narroway. Hi, you two. They're both project managers at March's Energy Agency, who I've already mentioned, and NEA have an extensive history in keeping householders warm and well at home through their programmes like Keep Shropshire Warm, which you may have heard of, Telford and Wrekin Energy Advice, and Warmer Derby and Derbyshire, so they're not just in Shropshire. And now, of course, they're project leads on Future Ready Homes as well. So today, Claire and Rob are here to explore the links between health and cold homes and explain what it is that you can do to stay warm and well at home. So thank you very much, Claire and Rob. I shall hand over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. Fantastic. I'll try and share my screen. Bear with me a second. Okie doke. Can everyone see that? Or does it look slightly odd?
We can see it, but not in full screen mode.
Not in full screen. Okie doke. Apologies, it's been a while since I used Zoom. Let's have a look. Stop sharing and try a different way. The beauty of a second screen. Is that better? Is that full size?
We can't see it at all now.
Right, okay. Oh, that's new. Okie doke. Let me close this.
Okay, so we can see it, but with the thumbnails down the left-hand side.
Okay, and I can't see it at all. Oh dear, this is not a good start, is it? So does it look differently to when we tested it then, Gemma?
Yeah, it came through full screen then.
It did, didn't it? Okay, look. I'm going to try a final attempt. Is that working?
So now we can see it in the view where we can see your next slide and notes.
Right, okay. Is anyone more experienced on Zoom and has any idea how to get rid of that? Or
I reckon maybe if you go back to your previous to how we could see it.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, now it's working.
Oh, it's working, as if by magic. Right, I'm not going to touch anything. Apologies for that, folks, but thank you for coming along this afternoon. As Jem said, obviously, Rob and I are from MEA, March's Energy Agency. I won't dwell too much on who we are and what we do, because I think quite a few of my colleagues are in the crowd, as it were. But we are a charity based in Shrewsbury. We've just celebrated our 25th sort of anniversary, birthday, whatever you want to call it, of supporting people to stay warm and well at home, which is an intentionally, quite vague catch-all term because the work that we do is quite varied. So we work with councils, sort of partner organisations, other charities, pretty much anyone supporting vulnerable people or in a position to, encourage the uptake of renewable technologies and sort of home energy efficiency measures. So the work we do is quite varied, as you can see here from this lovely snazzy slide that we've recently started using about our vision. And I think often it can seem that we almost have two strands. So we've got our fuel poverty work where we're supporting vulnerable people, and then we've got projects like Future Ready Homes where we're supporting people to, kind of make good decisions really and use their finance wisely when it comes to improving home energy efficiency. To me, this is what brings it all together. So I think overall, we're looking at working towards a world where everyone can afford to live in a warm, healthy home and where that doesn't have a detrimental impact on our environment. So we need both of those approaches and the whole array of our work really to get there. It's a big vision, but we have to, keep sort of pulling together and believing that we can achieve it essentially. So before we jump into this, I want to give a strong health warning since we're talking about health. I have no clinical background whatsoever. I've not done a single hour of health training. My background is very much project management. I manage a project called Healthy Home Shropshire, which not only provides support to vulnerable people experiencing fuel poverty, but allows some of my time to really dig into this topic really and look at the links between health and cold homes and have conversations with clinical professionals, with NHS staff, and look at how we can work together. So just to say, I'm far from a doctor, probably the furthest you could get, and I don't have a health background. This is coming from a look at the literature and a discussion with health and support professionals. So with that disclaimer out of the way, the first thing to sort of solidify in our minds really, because it can be quite an ephemeral thing to put your finger on, is what a healthy home is. And it's different for all of us because we use our homes in a different way and we want different things from our home. Generally, we can, group these aspects. So usually we need enough space and light to feel like it's a nice place to be. You don't want to be in a sort of dark, enclosed space where you might be, living, working, socializing. I think especially since COVID, the functionality that we need our homes to provide has changed quite a lot, and we're asking more from our homes than ever because a lot of us are spending more time working from home, and we've got quite used to socializing at home, I think, or not socializing at all. So it's really important that we have what we need within the building to have, let our mental health thrive, and we'll come on to physical health shortly as well. Good air quality is something we're going to be talking about quite a bit today, and something that my colleague Rob will be focusing on quite heavily. And there are two aspects to this really. So we need to prevent external pollution from entering the house wherever possible. So if we live on a busy main road, for example, we want to make sure not too many of those car emissions are coming in. Obviously, a certain level of that is unavoidable. So we also then need to be able to disperse those harmful particulates that might be in the home, that have either come in from the outside or might have been generated inside from things like, painting, cooking, even drying clothes is something I'd not thought of. But when that, when the laundry smells really nice drying on the rack, they're actually volatile compounds that are sort of evaporating from the fabric softener. So things like that, we just need to make sure the home is well enough ventilated so that those don't build up. Something I'll be focusing on particularly from my angle is sort of thermal comfort of the home. And we need to make sure that we're warm enough to be healthy and well, but equally and increasingly, and it feels like good timing to be talking about this after the last few weeks, not too warm either, because overheating is an increasing issue that we'll be looking at. And then again, that kind of ties into air quality really. We want to look at moisture levels. So focus is predominantly on preventing damp and mold from growing, which then has links into health and well-being. But also we don't want the air to be too dry because that can be irritating for our airways as well. So as you can imagine, quite a complex balance to get right. As illustrated by this lovely slide that I have shamelessly stolen from the UK Building Council. All the links to anything that I reference are at the end, so maybe if we circulate the presentation, if people do want to read various reports, I'd really recommend this one. It's very interesting, but I think this just illustrates really the variety of bits and pieces that we need to consider for a truly healthy, sort of ideal home, really. So we can see there a mention of laundry to make sure that we're not drying clothes in the house and increasing moisture levels. I think there's a point on there that I can't see about quiet space and soundproofness. And again, that's something that can have an impact on mental health and our ability to sort of thrive at home, really, and get what we need from the buildings that we live in. So onto the temperature front, this has stayed relatively sort of stable across the literature, really, and across the years of what is a healthy temperature. So for speaking for myself personally, as someone who's lucky enough to be, quite physically able and quite mobile, anything around the 18-degree mark is okay for most of us. So it's got minimal risk to a healthy person, as it says on the second line down, and heating living rooms, especially to about 18 degrees, is normally about right for most of us. In bedrooms, for example, that could be a little bit lower. Most of us like it to be a little bit cooler when we're trying to sleep. And obviously in rooms that we don't use much in the winter, we may choose to heat them on and off, as long as we're preventing mold and damp growth. For those who are more sedentary, maybe, possibly older people, younger people, people with limited mobility, or people who are chained to a desk for most of their working day, we can find that actually it needs to be a little bit warmer because your body's not generating its own heat by moving around. So we say about 21 degrees for people who need it a little bit warmer, but usually anything between 18 and 21 is absolutely fine. As we can see below 18, things start to get quite scary quite quickly, I think. So we're looking at increase of cardiovascular issues from the fact that our blood is moving more slowly in our veins and is essentially thicker. And then when we're getting as low as sort of 8 degrees and below, we are looking at the very immediate risk of hypothermia and death. So it does really drop off a cliff there in terms of health risks. As I just touched on in the previous slide, we all are at risk from being too cold at home, but there are certain groups who are more risk than others, essentially. So anyone who can't move around as much as the average person might be able to will be more affected. Anyone with existing conditions, so think arthritis is a good example, things like COPD, asthma. People with these conditions will report that they're worse in winter, and that's because they are directly affected by the coldness of the air, the density of that air that we're breathing in, and also the particulates and the moisture that we might also be breathing in. There's also quite a strong link to development of young people, children and young people. So there's a strong link to childhood asthma from being, brought up in a cold home that's consistently and chronically underheated, but also adolescents in particular are much more likely to develop mental health issues as a result of living in a cold home. That's something we won't dwell on too much today, really, but it is very much linked to social exclusion, social isolation, the stigma that comes with, any kind of shame around the home environment, and simply the picture there of someone studying, not being able to sort of use the home in the way that you need to, as we discussed earlier, so not being able to do homework at home because it's just too cold to focus. That's something we have seen firsthand, really, in our roles. There's an interesting one that I was not aware of, as I say, without my clinical background. So people with impaired sensitivity, so often this can be as a result of something like diabetes or a nerve condition, may not have the same sort of physical sensation of being too hot or too cold on their skin. So that means leaves them less able to respond to being too hot or too cold, and more at risk of things like hypothermia and overheating. And just a little note here that, obviously my work is in fuel poverty, so a lot of my examples might be quite extreme. These issues are often associated with lower income homes, but actually when we're looking at how easy or difficult it is to keep our homes, adequately heated and ventilated, it's also at least half to do with the building itself. So actually, we increasingly speak to a lot of people, especially in Shropshire, where we've got lots of, lovely period buildings that are very energy inefficient. Someone could have a strong income, stable income, and a comfortable lifestyle, but actually the building itself means that they're spending a huge portion of their income on just maintaining a comfortable indoor temperature. So this is not just a problem associated with lower income and vulnerable households, it can affect everyone. There are some specific impacts that cold homes have on our health. So as I mentioned, cardiovascular problems, most extreme example there being heart attacks. Mold and damp can build up if we have too much moisture in the home, and that can exacerbate respiratory conditions. And as I mentioned briefly, mobility issues are affected quite quickly, within minutes, sometimes about 15 minutes. Someone could sit down, not realise just how cold they have got, stand up quickly, and if they're sort of less mobile or have something like arthritis, this can increase the risk of trips and falls quite dramatically. I think we've touched on all of this. I guess the standout point to me here is the cost to the NHS. So there's another report that I'd really recommend a quick glance over, and I think the link there actually goes to the executive summary, which is the way forward if you ask me, on a 30-odd page report. It's all about cost to the NHS and cost to society. So as it says here, we're looking at about 1.4 billion a year to treat people who are affected by poor housing. Now that's quite general, and that could be things like, physical hazards in the home, causing falls and injuries. But actually, out of all of the housing issues, the costliest issue for the NHS is excess cold, and that's the £857 million per year that can be directly attributed to issues that wouldn't have been an issue that required NHS treatment if it weren't for the fact that that person was cold at home. So there are major benefits to be had from understanding and tackling this issue, essentially. This is another slide that I've stolen, and we've stolen it so much over the years that it's not great quality now, apologies, but it's a public health sort of snapshot really, that just gives a little look at the direct and indirect effects of being cold at home. Something I won't really touch on a huge amount is carbon monoxide poisoning, but that's on here. And again, it's the importance of making sure that our gas appliances are safe and that we've got carbon monoxide detectors in place and they're up to date and they've had their batteries changed and all that kind of good stuff. Just can't be overstated really. We work with Cadent to raise awareness of carbon monoxide poisoning, and it is again one of those things that's got a very immediate and often very severe health impact for all of us, regardless of age or existing health conditions or anything like that. So as I briefly touched on earlier, we're increasingly understanding the importance for a ventilation balance. So in the UK especially, we see ourselves as a cold country. Our priority is very much keeping heat in the property, getting heat in the first place and then keeping it in. And what that means is we make properties more airtight so that we're not losing as much of the heat that we're generating. But this also has a flip side in that the more heat we're keeping in, the more we're keeping in things like moisture, which leads to damp and mold buildup, and those particulates that we were talking about that might cause poor indoor air quality. This focus on retaining heat can also be a problem in the summer, which I'm sure a lot of us have experienced over the last couple of weeks, and I suspect we will do for another few months. And as we do see hotter and hotter summers, it's more of a risk of us becoming, dehydration is a big one for everyone, but particularly those who are more vulnerable to changes in the environment can suffer heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and it can actually have quite a negative impact on mental health as well. So whether that's, that feeling of being oppressed and it's really unpleasant, isn't it, being too hot, whether it's as sort of low level as that really, and it's also been seen to have direct impacts on things like schizophrenia to trigger an episode. We touched briefly on cold-related deaths, which I think was about 5,000 a year. So currently in England and Wales, we're estimated to lose 2,000 people per year to heat-related deaths. But as the country heats up as a result of climate change, we are looking at that potentially matching or even outstripping deaths from adverse cold up to about 7,000 by 2050. So it is something that we increasingly need to be considering. And as mentioned, this build-up of particulates and moisture in the house can have quite a serious impact, especially on children as their lungs are developing and their airways continue to grow. So what warning signs can we look for? I think in terms of the home, a lot of us will be relatively familiar with this. These probably will be quite familiar scenes if you've ever lived in a drafty old Victorian student house or anything like that. But it's things that we spot in the winter. So noticeable cold temperature, you walk into a room and it's clearly cold, or there are drafts swirling around from various places. Visible condensation is something that we see quite a lot and need to reduce as much as possible. So often this might occur in a bedroom in the morning because we've been emitting moisture by breathing as we sleep, and this will build up on usually windows, but walls, ceilings. And we get that musty smell as well, which is a result of the damp and mold sort of building within the room. The bottom image there is an example of rising damp that's affecting the plaster and sort of pulling the plaster off the wall essentially. So damp patches, they might be from condensation, so moisture that we're generating within the home that's then affecting the building, or it might be a fabric problem. So it might be something like rising damp or penetrating damp that's an issue with the building itself. As it mentions here, usually culprits for hiding mold growth, large furniture items, so things like, if you've got a sofa pressed against a wall, or wardrobes are another big one where often, we might go into someone's home and not know where the mold and damp's building up, and as soon as you look behind that wardrobe, it becomes glaringly obvious. And another sort of warning sign really is the peeling wallpaper, paint looking a little bit funny on one corner of it's usually high up one corner of the room, and that's suggesting that there might be a damp spot underneath there. In terms of health, I think in our experience at least, people are less aware of these warning signs and less plugged in to raise the alarm. Certainly in the winter, a lot of us get colds and various viral infections. Obviously, COVID's been a huge concern the last few years. But actually, if that's significantly worse in the winter and there's no other reason, it may well be that the home isn't an unhealthy environment and is contributing to that. Anything to do with circulation is affected quite badly by the cold. So if you're, sometimes fingertips might be cold to touch, or people who suffer from circulatory disorders like Raynaud's syndrome, for example, might actually see that their fingertips or even lips turn blue when they're quite cold. And that might be a warning sign before they feel particularly cold again, especially if that's tied into another condition, which might mean they don't have the same skin sensitivity. Any issues around difficulty breathing are obviously very serious and need to be checked out, and that can be due to the sheer coldness of the air, but more often than not, it is about the indoor air quality, the moisture buildup, the particulate buildup affecting our lungs and airways. Again, the mental well-being one is very, very difficult to attribute a cause. I think a lot of people, don't quite feel tip-top in the winter. We're missing the vitamin D and we're missing being out in the beer garden with our friends. But actually, when we look at just the experience of being uncomfortable all day, being cold, and then when we link that with maybe not wanting to invite people into the home because of the shame and stigma, and becoming increasingly isolated, we see quite clearly the link with that mental dip. And again, any kind of flare-ups of existing conditions, so I'm thinking joint conditions in particular, so arthritis, respiratory conditions like COPD, and a worsening of, say, like high blood pressure, can often be linked to a cold home in the winter as well. Well, I've given you all the bad news, so now my very capable colleague Rob is going to talk to us about how we can tackle these root causes and prevent these ill effects of cold homes. Go for it, Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to run through some of the kind of technical and retrofit related topics, as Claire just said, on how to tackle the root causes of some of these health problems, and some of the thinking behind some of the decision making that needs to be done with retrofit. Okay, so two of the main factors that affect health of you, but also of your home, are temperature and humidity. So focusing first on temperature, these are some of the factors that can affect the thermal performance of your home. So starting with insulation, first of all, a typical detached house that is uninsulated will lose about 35% of its heat through the walls, 25% through the roof, 15% through the floors. So that kind of gives an idea of just how much heat loss can happen just through the walls being, or the roof or whatever it is, being uninsulated. I've put there a lack of or defective insulation. So what I mean by defective insulation is that the insulation might be there, but it could be damaged in some way. It could be damp, perhaps, or it could have been disturbed. Thinking of loft insulation, if you're kind of digging around in a loft, you might have knocked some of it. Or if you're unsure if your walls or anything is insulated, then you can conduct some surveys to find out if you can, or if they are insulated. So a typical one for cavity wall insulation would be a borescope survey. Whereas if you've got internal wall insulation, then a simple kind of knock test should be able to reveal whether the walls are insulated or not. If it sounds a bit hollow, then there's a good chance that there's some insulation there. So going back to that house and the proportions of heat loss that I was talking about, drafts are the remaining kind of source of that heat loss. It's back on the previous slide, sorry, Claire. So the drafts kind of take up about 25% of that remaining heat loss. Typically that can be windows and doors where seals have loosened over time or the frames are kind of ill-fitting. But it can also be chimneys, letterboxes, loft hatches, all sorts. So from the thermal images at the bottom of the slide there, the middle one quite clearly shows a front door where there hasn't been adequate kind of draft proofing, and you can see the wispy kind of cold lines coming through that indicate the drafts. The thermal image to the left of that is the defective insulation. Thermal bridging is another kind of source of poor thermal performance of a house. So thermal bridging is where there is something to do with the building construction that is conducting heat from inside to out, or vice versa. So an example of that could be if you've got an uninsulated solid floor, concrete solid floor, then that can act as a thermal bridge, conducting the heat from inside straight to outside. Could also be joists, as shown in that third thermal image there. And with thermal imaging, they're a source of heat loss, but also you can see with that third thermal image, the joists are much colder than the rest of the ceiling, so that could cause condensation to form alongside or along that joist, and therefore is potentially a mold risk. And then the final kind of factor affecting thermal performance of a building is the heating system itself. So that can be if it's inefficient, if it's old radiators or storage heaters, perhaps, where particularly with the older storage heaters that charge up overnight and then actually lose a lot of the heat overnight. There's also the fact that gas and oil boilers can only be, even modern ones can only be a certain level of efficiency, compared to say a heat pump would be 300% efficient typically, if it's working well and the delivery system, large radiators or underfloor heating, is all sized properly. And then the final bit on that slide is just that there's a thermal performance test report on the right-hand side of the slide, which is scored really poorly, and that's because that particular house suffered from all of these factors. There was no insulation, plenty of drafts, plenty of thermal bridging, and a really inefficient storage heater system. Okay, so then another one is relative humidity or excessive relative humidity. So factors that affect humidity are avoidable moisture production. As Claire alluded to earlier, that could be drying clothes indoors. It could be simple things like lids off pans, taking long showers and not opening the windows, but keeping doors open so the moisture kind of vents throughout the house, all that sort of thing. The top graph of the slide and then the total risk score of 100 there relate to a social housing project in Herefordshire, where there was a tumble dryer that was venting through to the kitchen, and there wasn't enough ventilation, so that there was a really high moisture production, which led to the humidity being excessive. So then the other factor with relative humidity is inadequate ventilation, as I just said. So this is where there's the balance between air tightness, which can be a good thing for thermal performance if you're insulating and getting rid of those drafts, but it also means that ventilation can be compromised by it. There's various different sources of ventilation strategies. Passive strategies are kind of typical in older buildings, whether it's just natural drafts, as I said, if the frames of windows aren't fitted properly, fireplaces, etc. But there's also, the possibility of vents. More modern houses have trickle vents above the windows, and then there's mechanical ventilation or active ventilation on top of that. Extractor fans are probably the most commonly known of those, but you can also have more kind of purpose-built ventilation strategies. So for example, the house that I live in at the moment has what's called decentralized mechanical extract ventilation. So in all of the rooms that there would be excessive moisture production, like the kitchen, the bathroom, there is a really powerful extractor fan, essentially, which also filters in fresh air as well. So it not only extracts the air, but supplies the air too. So yeah, you get filtered fresh air as well. And you can have those that have a heat recovery capability as well, which I'll talk about in one of the other slides. Or you can get more centralized ventilation options. Mechanical ventilation with heat recovery is typically a centralized unit. And all that's to try and create the balance of humidity. So as it says at the bottom there, you want to try and achieve a humidity level of around 40 to 50%. So it's not too dry and you get the irritation that Claire was talking about earlier, whilst having a minimal impact on the thermal performance as well. The reason that you'd want to keep humidity below the kind of common threshold of 70%, which is normally a warning kind of point, is that humid air requires more energy to heat, and also increases the dew point. So with humidity at 70% or above, condensation will form more readily on surfaces at higher temperatures, which can obviously lead to damp and mold risk. And also high humidities can exacerbate health conditions as well. But it's not just humidity. For ventilation purposes, it's air quality as well. So Claire mentioned earlier that kind of off-gassing of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which are very easy to understand with paints and cleaning materials because they obviously smell quite strongly. But anything like carpets or laminate flooring or anything which has been painted or treated will be emitting some sorts of chemicals in vapor form, and often long past the point where you can smell them. Can be a period of years where it carries on releasing those chemicals, which can be quite toxic and have some serious health implications. But also you can get paints and treatments for wooden furniture, etc., that are VOC free, non-toxic. Claire alluded to the carbon monoxide risk as well, with any kind of burning of fuel, whether that's solid fuel or gas or oil boilers, and the importance of having a carbon monoxide detector. There's also external air pollutants, so that could be allergens such as pollen for hay fever, or if you live by a busy road, then it could be some of the nitrous oxide or particulate matter that you get from, or you can get from road pollution. And then the final one here is the one I'm going to focus in more depth, which is mold spores, which are abundant and almost can be thought of to be in a dormant state almost until they come into the right, or come into contact with the right conditions so they can actually proliferate. So that would be moist environments, so humid air. Misconception is that mold kind of thrives in cold conditions, whereas it actually kind of warm, moist conditions are usually where mold would grow most strongly. The point with the cold aspect is that's when you'll get the condensation forming on windows, but even walls and ceilings, and that's where the kind of the humid environment comes from for which mold would grow. So to tackle all of these, ventilation is key, either passive or mechanic. So any of the options that I ran through on the previous slide for ventilation strategies, and if you're conducting a retrofit that would increase the air tightness, insulating or draft proofing, then it must be, or ventilation must be considered to make sure that you've got a good balance of ventilation as well. And then just a little bit about dealing with mold, because it's becoming more and more prevalent. Making sure that you're wearing masks and gloves while to avoid exposure to the mold spores, so to avoid any kind of skin or respiratory irritation. Cleaning the area first with a damp cloth, and then using a mold specific spray, not bleach. Bleach is often talked about as a good one, but actually all that will do is it'll colour the mold spores. It won't actually do anything to treat them. So mold specific spray, a good homemade one, is just warm water and white vinegar. And then once the mold has been treated, thoroughly drying the area, and then making sure you wash your hands and any kind of cleaning products that you've used to deal with the mold to ensure all the mold spores are completely gone and not just going to be lingering around anymore. Okay. So this is from a joint project between Cadent and MEA. So this was my colleague Phil worked on this project, and they tested out a few different technologies, but the one that's most relevant to this webinar is the EnviroVent Heat Saver. So this is one of the decentralized ventilation units that I was talking about earlier that has heat recovery. So it runs continuously, but is a really quiet level, so it's not disturbing anything. Situated in rooms with high moisture production. Claims to be able to recover up to 75% of heat from extracted air. It's got a heat exchanger, so as warm air is extracted and cold fresh air is brought in, 75% of that heat can be exchanged. It's controlled by a humidistat, ramping up in 10% gradients, so it's kind of versatile as well. And essentially, it will reduce mold risk by removing the humid, stale air. It will save energy because it's got that heat recovery element, and it will also improve air quality as it filters for pollutants. So as part of the project, 11 participants had one of these EnviroVent heat savers. 8 of the 11 reported an existing respiratory condition, and those are some quotes there where damp and mold conditions improved hugely with this technology, and also it had a noticeable impact, a positive impact on their health conditions as well. There is a video in the top right corner. There's a link there if it will work.
Let's have a go. Can anyone see that video loading?
The
Just me.
coronavirus.
Okie doke. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation and share my screen instead. Bear with me.
Sorry, just to complicate things a bit more.
No, not at all. As soon as I saw the link, I thought, we should have rehearsed this. Righto. Can we see it now?
Yeah, I can see the video.
Excellent.
Pandemic has severely affected households across the Midlands. After installing measures to help householders during this stressful time, we wanted to find out how they were getting on with their new energy-saving technology.
It was quite a difficult time for us because my husband lost his job really early on, and so we really didn't have much income at all. So it was quite difficult for us for a while. We had to really adapt to the way we were living and what we were doing really. We were struggling with things like washing because we didn't want to use the tumble dryer because it's bad for the environment. Also financially it was adding quite a bit to our energy bill. So when drying laundry inside when it was cold weather was causing lots of condensation. My little one had some issues with things when he was younger. He got a couple of chest infections and things. We don't know if it was related, but obviously we wanted to find a solution for us that would, you know, really help with that.
Michelle had 2 EnviroVent heat saver ventilation units fitted and saw the benefits almost straight away.
The first thing I noticed in the bathroom was when you have a bath, the mirror, we've got a big mirror on one wall and it steams up all the time, and that really didn't happen so much. So we could tell immediately it was having an impact. We noticed a difference almost immediately, and the window out here wasn't steaming up either. So though they really were working as far as getting rid of the condensation, and once we cleaned all the mould up in there, it hasn't come back. So I can see that it's the summer and that has an impact, but we still get it all the year round. So, you know, we can see that it's working, so that's really good.
To help with the mould and condensation, Michelle had both units fitted by a local contractor sourced by March's Energy Agency. In North Shropshire, we met up with Lucy, who has also had an EnviroVent ventilation system installed. COVID-19 made paying for bills very difficult, whilst also dealing with a house overrun with damp and mould.
So every time we had a shower, you could see the damp spots on the wall, and it was really coming through. It was, I mean, the mould in the little bedroom was, as fast as I was cleaning it, it was coming back.
Lucy suffers with asthma, whilst her partner has COPD.
Some days it was horrific. I mean, you could hear him in bed at night, and he was wheezing, and it was getting to the point where he was laying on the sofa just to get some sleep, because it was that bad when he was upstairs. It was really bad at one point.
Lucy wanted to show us where the worst of the mould had been.
You can actually see here, we had a wet spot there, there, and there.
The unit works by continuously extracting moist air from rooms in the home, bringing in pre-warmed fresh air. The unit improves indoor air quality and saves energy costs, recovering up to 75% of the heat that would otherwise be extracted out. Shaheen lives in Derbyshire and has also had a ventilation unit fitted. As someone who suffers with anemia, Shaheen found the EnviroVent heat saver really beneficial.
The air feels a lot fresher. We did have a previous one, which was the normal one, and that was very noisy. So with this it seems a lot quieter, and not only that, it doesn't really affect you. It's like it's going in the background, but you don't seem to hear it.
It was great to catch up with Shaheen, Lucy and Michelle to see just how they were saving energy and money with their new installations.
Thanks so much, March's Energy Agency, for your help. It's been really, really great.
Try and get the presentation back for you, Rob.
Yeah, that was a good example anyway of one type of ventilation strategy that has clearly worked pretty well.
Get the feeling you're not seeing the presentation I'm seeing, Rob, because you've not continued. Is it still on the video for you?
It was back to the environment slide.
Oh, good. What's working? Excellent. Apologies.
Yeah, that's back.
Competence, wonderful. Ready for the next one?
Yes, please. Okay, so hopefully people might have heard of a whole house approach. It's a kind of a buzzword in retrofit at the moment. So I'm just going to explain some of the principles behind it. Essentially, it's considering your house as a series of connected systems that are all dependent on each other and can all affect each other if they're changed. So all the elements are connected. It means that there are interactions between measures as well, so retrofit measures. So, for example, as I've said already a few times, if you increase the air tightness of the property by insulating, then that can have effects on ventilation. It can also be that if you install, say, a heat pump system, have it sized for your current conditions, and then a year later do some insulation works, then suddenly the heating demand is vastly reduced because you've insulated well. And it means you've got an oversized heat pump, which is, there are worse problems to have, but you've spent time and energy and money getting a bigger heat pump than needed. Another kind of buzzword around retrofit is no regrets retrofit. So this basically means doing something or not doing something that is going to inhibit further action later on. So a good example of that might be installing external wall insulation and then a bit of time later thinking, really could have done with replacing the old double glazed windows with kind of more efficient ones. And then to access the windows, you've got to disrupt a lot of the external wall insulation, which is going to be a bit of a pain to do, but could also impact on the kind of the air tightness of the building by doing that, and could render the insulation well, not useless, but certainly compromised. So yeah, the order of retrofit matters essentially, and that's where I'm going to refer to this energy hierarchy in the top right. So essentially there are three kind of layers to this hierarchy. The first one is all about reducing the demand of your energy. So this is by insulating, repairing, increasing air tightness, everything that I've been talking about. It's about getting your energy use down to as low as possible. And then once you've reached that point where you can't reduce your energy demand anymore, then you go about trying to find ways of making it more efficient. So that's the second layer, increasing energy efficiency. So this will typically be upgrading systems, heating systems, ventilation systems, to make them as energy efficient as possible. And then once you've done those first two steps of basically trying to reduce your energy use and make it more efficient, then you can start thinking about renewable energy. The reason why you wouldn't want to think about renewable energy before that is, again, it's about sizing and modeling for your energy demand. So once you've reduced your energy demand to as low as you can possibly get it, then you can get solar panels and maybe a battery system for that exact energy demand. And then a last little point to consider is maximizing cost effectiveness by doing things at the same time, essentially. So if you put in external wall insulation on your house, that's going to involve scaffolding. So you may as well make the most of that scaffolding and do a roof repair or loft insulation or anything like that at the same time. Or the example I've given on the slide is if you're thinking about doing underfloor heating for a heat pump, then you may as well insulate the under the floor at the same time while you're there. Ultimately, it's all about making thorough planning, not jumping into any rash decisions. It's considering all the elements of the house. Okay, so this slide is all about materials. There's loads to consider with choosing materials, but the main factor that I'm going to focus on with this slide, because it's relevant to the health focus of this webinar, is breathability of materials. So there's various terms. Vapor open and vapor closed means breathable and non-breathable, or permeable and non-permeable. Often with older kind of traditional buildings, they've been designed to be breathable, vapor open, where the moisture is allowed to diffuse through the solid walls. And then if these are retrofitted with modern materials, so you add some insulation that has a non-permeable membrane or rendering on the outside, that then prevents the moisture from diffusing through the wall, that can then trap the humid air inside the building, which could then, it's still going through the solid brick, it could then condense within the walls, causing interstitial condensation and potential damp problems. And particularly in timber frame structures, if you get this the kind of humidity between the walls, this can cause quite significant damage just through rotting the wood. So again, with the last slide in mind, when choosing materials, you've got to use a whole house approach to consider the unique construction of your building, what's happened to it, what materials are involved, before deciding on what you're going to be doing. There's various solutions around this. You don't have to be restricted to certain materials. So you could use vapor open materials, breathable materials such as lime rendering or wood fiber insulation to allow the movement of moisture. These are often more natural materials, so could be considered more sustainable as well. But you could use modern vapor closed, non-breathable alternatives. And then to address the ventilation balance, you've then got to think about mechanical ventilation systems instead. Okay. And then the last slide on the kind of retrofit solutions is for overheating. So the degree of overheating in your house will depend on the materials used in the construction and the airtightness of the building. If you've got no insulation, then you'll probably experience quite rapid swings of temperatures where the building heats up quickly, but also the heat dissipates quite quickly. Whereas if you've got an insulated building, then it can smooth that kind of curve over a little bit. So if it's, quick flashes of warmer temperatures outside, that can protect against it quite well. But if it's more kind of concerted, longer period of warmer temperatures, then it can almost work the other way around, where the warmer temperatures get into the house, and then because you've got good insulation, it can actually mean that the house stays warmer for longer. If you've got lots of window area as well, then it means you've got more solar gain coming through. If you've got conservatories, then that can be a big factor for heating up the building. That's why you should probably consider getting or making sure the conservatory is thermally separate from the rest of the house. I mean, that's just as relevant in the colder temperatures as well, because conservatories can be a big source of heat loss as well. But in terms of solutions for what you can do to counteract that overheating, the first one is trying to reduce solar gain. So that's shading. If you're lucky enough to have deciduous trees near your house or room to plant deciduous trees, then they can provide a perfect seasonal balance of shading in the summer and then allowing the sunlight through in the winter. Blinds are probably the next best thing, or no, sorry, shutters are the next best thing, as they would block the solar gain from getting through to the windows, whereas blinds, the solar gain still gets through to the windows, and the blinds would just act as a kind of insulative layer. And then possibly a more high-tech solution would be using low emissivity coatings or paints for windows. So it's a transparent kind of coating that you apply to the window, and it just means that the windows reflect more of the infrared light rather than letting it through. So the effects of solar gain can be kind of mitigated. And then in terms of active cooling, the benefit of heat pumps is that, as well as providing heating, they can provide cooling as well. You can do this with a wet central heating system, although it doesn't work as effectively. Running kind of colder temperatures through a radiator system will have a very minimal cooling effect, whereas air-to-air heat pumps that employ fan blowers, they're effectively air conditioning units, so they would be very effective with cooling. The obvious kind of connotation for that is that there would be increased energy usage because you're using active cooling over the summer period. But then it's perfect conditions for your solar panels to power them. Lots of sunshine throughout the day. Okay.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Rob. Just a very quick final slide from me to wrap up. It's essentially a bit of an overview of what we do as an organisation. As Jem mentioned, we operate in Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, and up in Derbyshire. And we kind of have stage names, I like to think of them. So our energy advice services are called Keep Shropshire Warm in Shropshire, Telford Energy Advice in Telford, and Warmer Derby and Derbyshire in Derby and Derbyshire, funnily enough. And essentially we provide support to anyone sort of worried about, meeting, sort of making ends meet, paying their energy bills, issues with the home itself, things like, everything we've talked about today, damp and mold and impacts on health, but also those of you just looking for some guidance. So as Jem mentioned with the Future Ready Homes project especially, it's very much an information and guidance project for those looking to improve their home energy efficiency. But if it is just, a simple quick question of what's the best loft insulation, can I trust this installer who's mentioned this scheme called Eco, for example, pretty much anything to do with being warm at home or energy supplies or heating systems, we certainly will do our best to help. So do feel free to get in touch. There's also Keep Herefordshire Warm in Herefordshire, which does very similar work to us. So if you're Herefordshire based, give them a quick Google. Again, similar setup to us. It's a free impartial energy advice service. And yeah, I think that's everything from us. So we've got a few sources and links here that will be circulated around, I'm sure. And obviously, if you have any questions specifically for myself or Rob, our email addresses are at the bottom there, just our names, and then at mea.org.uk. So I will shut up and wait for questions now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire. That was really, really interesting. And Rob, yeah, fascinating. The temperature I found particularly interesting when you got down to kind of 16 degrees, which I would have thought was actually quite comfortable, when it could potentially be really quite unhealthy. So yeah, that was really fascinating. And of course, moisture, ventilation, really, really important to retrofit, and often not the first port of call that people are thinking about. So thank you. As Claire said, we will circulate the slides as well as the recording, so you'll have all of those details and you can do some extra digging as you wish with all of those reports that Claire has been referencing. Right, which brings us on to the FAQ session. So we've got a few questions that have come in already. Please feel free to drop others in and we shall pick things off. Tony.
I can unmute myself. How nice. Right. Rob, I think most of these are for you. First question is about cavity wall insulation. Can you provide more details about testing to assess the efficiency of cavity wall insulation? I think this was with thermal imaging.
Or it could be the boroscope survey as well. I'll very quickly talk about both. So the boroscope survey is to test whether the insulation is there at all. It would just involve drilling into the walls, a really tiny hole into the walls, so a small camera can go in there and visually inspect for insulation, and then the hole is obviously repaired afterwards. For testing for the efficiency of the cavity wall insulation, thermal imaging can be really effective for it, or I've found it to be really effective for it, particularly for looking for kind of the gradients across the wall. So if you imagine a side of a house, if I can capture the whole wall in my thermal image and then apply an analysis tool that will find the minimum and maximum temperatures across the wall, then you can see whether the wall is of a consistent temperature profile, which would imply that the insulation is consistent throughout the wall. Whereas if there's lots of spikes and troughs of temperature profile, then it would suggest that there are areas of the wall which might not be insulated as well as other areas.
Okay, and is that remediable?
Yeah, you can, well, with cavity wall insulation, it certainly is. It would just be a case of injecting the cavity wall insulation into the wall. It might be a case of trying to remove the existing cavity wall insulation as well. If there are problems with the cavity wall insulation, so it might have sagged a little bit, compressed, or even become damp. So you'd need to remove it in that case.
Right. But if it's otherwise, if it's just gaps, you sort of fill the gaps with further injection.
Yes.
Okay. Helen asked sort of follow-on question to that, talking about affordability, of course. So how do people, I suppose that's how do people introduce the ventilation that they need into their homes on an affordable way? And also, can you comment on older and listed buildings?
For ventilation. Well, some of the environment heat saver one that Phil's project worked with, I think, is a relatively cheap in terms of ventilation units. Anyway, those kind of decentralized individual units would be cheaper to install than one big centralized mechanical ventilation with heat recovery unit, which involves ducting and all sorts throughout the house. Other than that, installing trickle vents might be the cheapest option, I guess, of windows.
Trickle venting windows, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And presumably listed buildings, obviously, we would have to say, consult your listed buildings officer, apply for planning permission before you go bashing holes in the house. That may not go down very well. So a question from Matt about MVHR, which you've just mentioned, that's the mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. I should say, just as a general comment, it does produce a wonderful atmosphere. It is lovely having fresh, a regular supply of fresh, warm air into the home. But as Rob just said, it does require ducting throughout the home. And it can be a bit of a pain, especially in older homes, getting the ducting through. So Matt's question, I think it relates to the filters in the MVHR. What are the options to reduce humidity when bringing in external air with MVHR?
So would that be if the external air was particularly humid itself?
Yeah, I suppose if it's pouring with rain outside, for example. Then
the humidistat would try and counteract that by shutting off the ventilation. Essentially, it would weigh up the balance between internal and external environments to see which is the least humid.
Okay, thank you. Question about big problem for healthy living are chemicals. You mentioned this, but haven't made it clear that this is a major issue, can be remedied very cheaply by exchanging synthetic for natural materials. That's nothing to do with temperature. I think, Ingrid, you may be commenting on insulation materials, which, of course, there is always the choice of natural materials, sustainable materials, instead of chemical ones. If you're talking about chemical pollutants in the air, then again, these ventilation systems are fantastic because they have filtration systems. So they will make sure that the air that you're breathing in the home is clean and healthy. Is there an issue with fitting single room MVHR units?
Can I just comment on that, please? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
so many, actually, the majority of houses I've come across, having run the cleaning business, is full of crude oil-based materials. That could be paints, that could be furniture, carpets, clothing. And because you are talking about health, that was your first slide, I think it is very important to point out that whatever you do, you need to look at the basics. So if you insulate the house and put a proper ventilation system in, that does not solve the problem if you carry on having all these chemicals and synthetic fibers in your house, because they will just be there, and the air is always polluted. The same goes for the insulation materials, as I said in my chat. If you have wood fiber and wool insulation, then that already will allow for the air to ventilate or to flow in a different way, because the moisture is constantly carried outside through the walls. And so you do not need electric support with your ventilation systems, because someone mentioned the cost effectiveness of these things. So it's always a question what we are doing. So if people insulate the houses, especially with old houses, we've seen that in several places. Insulation, especially something like Kingspan, is being glued onto existing old walls, and the render is still on the wall. The water is not being funneled away outside with a land drain, for instance. You always get the moisture inside the house, and that's why it really needs to be looked at a lot more in detail, what kind of house it is and what materials are being used.
Yes, thank you, Ingrid. So what Ingrid is talking about, as we've mentioned in previous webinars, is the difference between vapor open and vapor closed construction, and the use of vapor open and vapor closed insulating materials. You're absolutely right to highlight that. Thank you. If we can move on, we were looking at the issue of fitting single room MVHR units in very thick stone walls. We have a response saying, yes, you can. So thank you for that. Right, some chat about the Eco 4 scheme. You may also have heard about Eco Plus scheme, which has now been renamed the Great British Insulation Scheme. That is, we understand it, it's just sort of kicking off. The electricity suppliers are funding that and are making that happen, though it's in its infancy. So if you contact your supplier or have a Google of Great British Insulation Scheme, you may find cavity wall or loft insulation is available. Eco 4, we can help you at MEA, so do get in touch with Keep Shropshire Warm. I believe we're running out of questions. Has anybody else got anything they want to raise? If not, I can hand it back to Jem.
Lovely. Yeah, looks like that's about it. Great. Well, not very much left for me, other than to say, let's see if I can bring this out. We have another webinar coming up on the 24th of July. That's back to our Monday slot at 1 p.m, which is all about wood burning stoves. I think this could be quite a popular one, and I'm expecting there to be a very animated Q&A, much like we had on our solar webinar, because there are many of you out there that use wood burners to help reduce your carbon or gas use, bring down your fuel bills, and because you like them. But obviously there is lots of debate around just how sustainable they are. So yeah, we're looking forward to exploring that with Jeremy Brignall-Thorpe from Lightfoot in Powys. We've also got a number of other events planned, webinars planned for this year, dates to be confirmed on all sorts of topics, including windows and doors, low cost measures. So that has come up today. What can you do to make improvements cheaply? And heaps of other things. If there's anything that you would particularly like to see, please let us know. There'll be the opportunity to give us some feedback when I get back in contact with you after this. And of course, keep in mind and keep an eye out for more information about Green Doors coming up in October. That is running across the 3 counties, Shropshire, Herefordshire and Powys. And it's a really great opportunity to go and see homes that have been retrofit already and talk to the homeowners. We found it every year. It's been incredibly popular. It's just a really informative, easygoing way to find out about retrofit. And of course, go and have a snoop around your next door neighbours' homes and look at their kitchens. I didn't say that though. So look out for that. And if you would like to take part and open your own home, if you've done some retrofit, then please get in contact with us. We want as many as possible. We would love to see open homes on every street corner to help inspire others to do the same and educate them. So please join us. Join our retrofit army. We would love you to. So that is all, I think. Thank you very much to Claire and Rob from MEA and Tony as well for doing the FAQ for Q&A for us as usual. Excellent job there. And we look forward to seeing you next time.